Okay, this week we're going to be talking about type and layer styles in Photoshop. So I have Photoshop open and I'm just clicking on Create New, and we're going to get a blank document already set up for us. We'll just do a 2000 pixel grid document. We'll leave our background set to white, but just keep in mind you could change it to whatever color you would like. So this will just give us a blank white canvas on which we can work. What I'm going to go do is I am going to go to my toolbar and click on the horizontal type tool. So there's two ways to enter type in Photoshop. One is by clicking and dragging. You're creating a little text box here. When you do this, this is called entering paragraph type. That is one way to enter type. By the way, whenever I did that, Photoshop automatically filled it with what we call placeholder text. This is Latin. This is what we call lorem ipsum. Just like that. That's just so Photoshop can show you what your document is going to look like when you actually do add text to it. So this is paragraph type, adding paragraph type by clicking and dragging to create a text box. That's one way to add type. Go away. We're going to click and drag that down here. Another way is just by clicking, and that adds what we call point type. It's not controlled by a box, not limited by the boundaries of a box, as paragraph type was. Point type just allows you to type and type and type and type and type, and it will just keep going. If you wanted to, if you were typing something, like I am typing, but then I wanted to go to a new line, you can hit enter or shift enter to force it to go to a new line like that, and then I can continue typing. So this is point type. So we had point type, and we also had paragraph type. So I'm going to type out the word typography, and I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to change this to a slightly larger size. We'll leave it black. We'll leave it the current font that it is, and we're just going to drag it right over here to the middle. Now, keep in mind, if I have the Move tool selected, this works with anything, not just type. If you hold Alt or Option, you can drag off copies of whatever you have selected. So here we have our first one. We're talking a little bit about type here. Let's change the second one. Let's change the actual font that it is. Photoshop by default has a bunch of different fonts that are installed. You can also add additional fonts by clicking on this button right here that says Add Fonts from Typekit. Adobe has a additional service called Adobe Typekit that if you pay for Photoshop or you have an educational account that you have free access to. It has thousands upon thousands of fonts. These are different than the ones that are installed by default that you guys have access to in Photoshop, but you can find one that you like. There's all these search parameters you have over here, and this is what we're going to be talking about. But if I want something maybe a little bit thicker, let's try a sans serif font. We'll make a thick weight. We can really kind of see what we're getting here. Let's say that I like Newberry Sans. If I want to install this into Photoshop, all I have to do is click on this little switch over here that says Activate Fonts. It'll tell me that it's doing it. Our font activation is now successful. So now if I go back to Photoshop and it's telling me I have added all of the Newberry font family, I can now highlight this one. And we're going to come up here to our list of fonts. And if I go down here, look, Newberry Sans Pro. And if I hit this little caret beside it, I can see all of the different various fonts that are contained within it. Italicized, bold, extra bold, etc., etc. Let's go with extra bold. There we go. So you can also install fonts from the internet. You're not limited to the ones that are just in Typekit. You can search for fonts. Let's pull up Google, not Google Images, but just Google. And or you can just go to dafont.com. This is a list of free fonts that are usable by anybody and everyone. Once again, we have different ways that it's categorized by. Let's click on Groovy, and this should give me a bunch of fonts that they're calling Groovy here. Let's go to Neon 80s, and I will click Download. We'll unzip the file, I'll pull it up. And if I want to actually install it, all I have to do is find the actual font file, which is normally a .ttf or .otf, double-click it, and that will install the font on your machine. Now, you do, like I said earlier, you have to have admin rights on the computer that you're using in order to install fonts. If you're using a computer that's shared in a library, you probably won't be able to add it unless somebody comes around and helps you. Now, there are other free font websites too. One of my favorites is League of Movable Type. Has some really nice professional looking fonts. They often will ask for donations, which I normally try to do anytime I'm using a font. They have lots of stuff that I use quite often. But let's say that we wanted, let's go to Blackout. Normally there's a link at the very bottom that says download. Once you click on that, you'll get your font file. Same thing. We're just going to unzip it. Wait patiently to unzip the file. And this one gave us a bunch of different fonts here that we're just going to, we'll just open up some of them and we'll hit install. And these are also .ttf. We're just installing these fonts. So we've installed Blackout, and then we also installed a font called Neon 80s. So now if I go back to Photoshop, let's go on this one. Control or Command click it, automatically selects that layer, and we've got it highlighted. Let's check out what Blackout looks like. Let's see, Blackout should be, oh, there we are. Blackout 2 AM was the one that I installed. Gives us that type of look. That's not it highlighted, that's just what the font actually looks like. The other one we had was Neon 80s, so we'll highlight this one. By the way, you can also just type in here, and it will automatically pull that one up. So that's Neon 80s. So that was a little bit about installing fonts and using them. We talked about Typekit. We talked about finding font files online as well, and then how to actually change the font too. Let's get rid of some of those. We'll keep our original. I'm going to hold Alt or Option, drag off. Whoops, let me try that again. Alt. There we go. I'll drag off some more copies. Talk a little bit more in depth about fonts. I'm going to change this font to what we call a serif font. Here we go. Bodoni 72 small caps is what I changed this to. And let's poke out this one. Let's zoom in and look at these two. So here we have two different types of fonts. This one on top is a sans serif font. This one on the bottom is a serif font. Sans meaning without, and serif meaning feet. Once again, more Latin. And we're going to zoom in on the serif font, and I'm going to show you some different aspects of it. So these things that I am selecting in here, these are what we call the serifs. Serifs are little small decorative embellishments on the end of fonts. They normally make type that is like in smaller form, like on a newspaper or on a blog or something like that. They make it more legible or easier to read. That's where you normally see a lot of serif fonts. Sans serif fonts, notice the one up at the top, this one does not have any decorative things. It's a lot simpler. They look good when they're printed large, and they help without confusing someone. So you'll notice large signs and stuff like that will have sans serif fonts such as this. Other fonts that we talk about, or font types at least, would be script fonts. Those are like our cursive-y type fonts. Let's see if we've got a script font in here. Yes, I just saw one. Beloved. This is a script font. Monospace fonts are fonts that have the exact same amount of space in between each letter. And yeah, so we've got sans serif at the top. We've got our serif font right there in the middle, and then we have our script font down here at the bottom. You really got to think about what you're trying to do whenever you're designing with type, and which font would be best suited for what you're trying to create. For example, if you're making a logo for a wedding photographer, you would probably want to maybe use something that has script, or like if you're making an invitation to somebody's wedding. Once again, we're stuck on weddings here. You're going to once again use something that has maybe more of a script feel to it. And if you remember Typekit, it had stuff like script as something that you could actually search for. You can search for all different types of fonts depending on what you're trying to do. Okay, let's talk about how to modify some of these fonts. Let's go down here to the script font. A little bit difficult to read, and that's because some of these letters are overlapping. But if I click inside of here and I hold the Alt or the Option key and use my arrows, I can space out these letters individually. This is called adjusting the kerning. Kerning is the space between two individual letters in a word. And normally, if you're designing somebody's logo or something like that, something where one or two words are extremely important, your kerning is something you're going to want to pay very close attention to make sure that you get it exactly correct. Now, if I were to highlight everything and hold Alt or Option and use my arrow keys, now that I'm adjusting the spacing between every single letter in this, that's called adjusting the tracking. And if I pull up the character panel, I have little ways that I can quickly access and change all the different spacing elements of a lot of stuff. Let's hit check mark. I'm going to now add a paragraph type, which hopefully will autofill with lorem ipsum. There we go. Let's change this from beloved to something else. Let's go to Futura. We'll hit this caret, and we'll go to Futura medium. Okay, now you'll notice that this is not overlapping in terms of the tracking. This is overlapping in terms of the vertical spacing of my various lines of text. That is what we call leading, spelled like lead, but pronounced leading. Refers to printing presses and what they would put in there to separate lines of type. You can change that also with Alt or Option and your arrow key. This time I'm hitting up and down arrow key to spread that out. But you can also change it over here as well. All I'm doing, you can click on this little drop-down menu and change the leading manually. Normally, you want to have this letter match the size of your font, or you can hover over the little icon beside it and then click and drag to adjust the leading there. Now, I thought that the tracking of this was a little bit too spread out, so what I'm going to do is come over here, and we're going to hover over that, and we can manually adjust the tracking. Now, if I wanted to adjust the kerning, I would come in here, click in between two individual letters, hold Alt or Option, and then use my arrow keys to adjust the kerning, just like that. Now, if I hold Shift and Option and hit up or down, I'm moving just certain letters up or down. This is called the baseline shift, and it's fairly complicated. It's just kind of like, if you remember when you learned how to write letters, they would have those little lines where that would tell you where the top of your lowercase e would go and where the bottom of your letters would go and where the top would go. That's called the baseline, and this allows you to shift it up or down by highlighting, holding Alt or Option, and Shift, and using your up or down arrow keys, depending on what you wanted to do. So what we just talked about, we talked about adjusting the kerning, which is the space between two individual letters. By the way, if we combine letters like this is what we call a ligature. We also talked about the tracking, which is when you're combining or you're adjusting the space between all the characters in any given line. And then we also talked about the leading, which is where you can space things out. It's the space between individual lines of type. All of those can be controlled by highlighting and using arrows and your Alt or Option key. But more specifically, if you want to have a lot of precise control, you pull up the character panel under the window menu. And that pulls it right here. If I wanted to access this pretty easily, I would drag it and then dock it in with some other panels there. That way I could pull up character just by clicking on it instead of having to go up to the Windows menu. Something else that's important to talk about in terms of text, if we zoom in and we look at this text, it's displayed by pixels because we're looking on a computer, but technically it is what we call a vector file. A vector file is any image or visual representation that's not necessarily created by pixels, but instead by paths and anchor points and a mathematical formula that tells it how to fill in those paths and anchor points. So that is to say that let's see the paths here, if we can convert this to a path. Okay, paths. There we go. All right. So all these hard blue squares that you see are what we call anchor points, and then the lines that are connecting them, between them, those are called paths. Paths and anchor points create vector images. Vectors are not made out of pixels. They're not rasters. People like paths, or people like vector images, because you can resize them, make them as big or as small as you would like, and they will never look pixelated. So a lot of graphic design work, if you're making a logo that somebody's going to end up printing really big and really small, you make it out of vector files. That way it can be printed at any size and will always look the same. It will always look good. It will never look pixelated. So what Photoshop does is it takes these paths and anchor points, and then if you kind of zoom in, you can tell that what it does is it fills them in with pixels depending on the size. So here we can see both the anchor point, we can see the paths, and then we can also see the pixels that Photoshop was using to fill that in with on the inside. So that's important for a couple of reasons. If I had taken this, this text, and I wanted to do something to it, let's see. There are certain things that you, like if I wanted to actually brush over this layer, you can see that's not going to let me do that, and that's because this is a vector file. If I wanted to do something different to this layer or brush over it or whatever, I would first have to rasterize it. You saw that it said, do you want to rasterize this? I've right-clicked the layer now, and there's a little section here that says rasterize type. What that does is it takes the anchor points and it takes the paths, and then it just fills it in with pixels, and it leaves as pixels. That would now be a raster image instead of a vector image. A raster is something made out of pixels. A vector is something made out of paths and anchor points. We'll talk more about that later. So in this video, we talked a lot about type basics. We talked about how to create type, point type, paragraph type. Paragraph type is with a text box. We talked about lorem ipsum placeholder text. We talked about how to add new fonts to Photoshop through Adobe Typekit and also downloading some on the internet. We talked about the several different types of fonts that you have, sans serif fonts, serif fonts, script fonts, etc., how they would be useful depending on what you're wanting to do. And then we also talked about spacing within a font. We talked about kerning, how the kerning is the space between two individual characters. Tracking is the space throughout every character in a line or multiple lines. And then your leading is your spacing between multiple lines of type. So next video, we're going to talk about layer styles, but that is it for